Thor: The Dark World is the second film in Phase 2 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the second film of now 4 films based on the hero Thor. This has never been the most loved film in the MCU, and for a long while I didn't watch end to end. Now I think I saw it in its entirety twice, but when I first saw it back in 2014, I fell asleep probably 20 minutes into the film and just rode it out sleeping, I guess. I also feel like this is one of the least memorable films in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and I am literally writing this retrospective the day I've watched the film, and it doesn't really stick in my mind that much because everything, from the hero to the villain, just falls a bit short and is kind of bland. Production on Thor: The Dark World started before the release of the first film, with Kevin Feige confirming out the gate that Thor would have sequels. Don Payne, who wrote the first film, was working on ideas before the first film came out and would ultimately come up with the final script concept used, though the film would be completed after he passed away from bone cancer in 2013. The initial release date planned by Disney was July 26, 2013, but that would later be moved to November 2013, and Kenneth Branagh decided to opt out of returning for the sequel due to the fact that it needed to be a fairly fast turnaround, and the amount of work that the first film took, likely multiplying even for the second entry. Patty Jenkins, director of Wonder Woman down the line, was in negotiations to direct, but that ultimately fell through in December 2011 due to the ever-classic creative differences that are oh so common at Marvel, with her plan being to make a Romeo and Juliet-esque concept between Thor and Jane, which Marvel wasn't all that interested in pursuing to the level Patty wanted. Daniel Minahan and Alan Taylor were considered as replacements, with both having worked on other fantasy works like HBO's Game of Thrones, though Alan Taylor was ultimately chosen to direct. Mads Mikkelsen and Benedict Cumberbatch were both considered for Malekith, but the role fell through for Benedict Cumberbatch, who would eventually go on to play the role of Doctor Strange for the franchise. Christopher Eccleston ultimately got the role, who's probably most notable for playing the Doctor in Doctor Who for a long time, along with several other roles. In late 2012, the film started shooting, with it all being completed in mid-2013 for release later that year. The plot follows Thor, who's back on missions with his pals, the Warriors 3 and Sif, who are defending the Nine Realms, with Thor not having been on Earth for very long, bar his brief stint as an Avenger, fighting against his brother in the Avengers film. Loki is now a prisoner on Asgard, and things are kind of back to normal. That is, until back on Earth, Jane Foster and her assistant Darcy discover a strange, parking structure that has cosmic abnormalities, which eventually leads Thor back to Earth to see what's going on and meet with his former flame, Jane. Jane, however, fell in one of these anomalies and is now infected with a strange burst thing that causes her to repel people, so Thor takes her off to Asgard to investigate. The Asgardians investigate what's happening to Jane. It is, however, Odin himself who knows what's happening, and that the abnormality is the power of the ether, the film's MacGuffin, and also what would later become Thanos' Reality Stone. Odin says that the Dark Elves once used it to try to destroy the Seven Realms. They look to find out how to remove the Aether from her without killing her, while Jane meets Thor's mom, Frigga. However, the Aether wakes the Dark Elves from their stasis that was imposed upon them by Thor's grandfather, Bor, generations earlier. Malekith, the leader of the Dark Elves, mounts an assault on Asgard that causes serious damage, but Frigga manages to fight off Malekith until she's ambushed and killed. Thor wounds Malekith and the Dark Elves retreat to regroup as Thor mourns his fallen mother. Odin locks up Jane to sort stuff out, but Thor knows that won't work and that the Dark Elves will return, so he takes Loki, who is equally torn up about their mother's death, the Warriors 3, Sif, and Jane, and they flee to confront the Dark Elves, though the Warriors 3 and Sif have to stay back as a diversion for the rest of the Asgardians, and to, I guess, make the climax less bloated, I don't know. Thor, Jane, and Loki confront Malekith, who manages to take the power of the Aether from Jane and attempts to attack Earth after supposedly killing Loki. Thor teams up with his Earth friends, Jane, Darcy, Darcy's intern, and Dr. Selvig to defeat Malekith with Dr. Selvig's new teleporting invention thing. Anyhow, they fight and Thor wins the battle, teleporting Malekith's giant ship on top of him, killing the villain. On Asgard, we learn that Loki was indeed alive, and seemingly held his father hostage and is impersonating the King of Asgard. Along with the returning characters Thor, Odin, Jane, Darcy, the Warriors 3, and Sif, Thor the Dark World introduces some new characters to the fold, mostly just new villains, but regardless, we had Malekith the Dark Elf, who was created by legendary Thor writer Walter Simon and first appeared in Thor 344 from 1984, being a pretty frequent adversary of Thor throughout the years. Admittedly, Thor has never been one of my favorite heroes since fantasy isn't really my thing, but I know enough about Malekith that I think they did a solid job bringing him to live action. Curse of Algren showed up in this film, first appearing in Thor 347 along Malekith as kind of the muscle role, and that role kind of continues in this film. This film kind of has a bloated cast, as was the problem with the first few Thor movies. I feel like Kenneth Branagh kind of wanted this epic journey tale or something and introduced this whole huge cast, and this film was forced to kind of deal with them despite not really having much to do with them.
I will give you as much time as I can. Thank you, my friend.
Thor is obviously the lead of the film, following the events of the Avengers and the first Thor film. Thor has grown a closer attachment to the people of Earth, and this leads him to constantly think about Earth and his love Jane, who, following the first film, he could not see at first. Then he kind of just didn't bother seeing her following the events of the Avengers, with him being busy with all the Nine Realms shit. Thor eventually gets pulled into this adventure as Jane and her crew discover the anomaly, and Thor wants to investigate, eventually leading to the liberation of the Dark Elves after their long, hibernation, I guess. Thor is sad when his mom dies. This is his first real loss as a space demigod. However, as you may know, if you watch this franchise, this is far from Thor's only loss. This is something that Marvel seems to kind of replay repeatedly, which I think they comment fairly brilliantly in Thor 4, despite that movie being mostly pretty bad. Loki also returns, now a prisoner following the assault on Earth he headed during the Avengers. At first he is passive, but when his mom dies he joins Thor out of grief, and eventually uses his freedom as a way to get a hold of the throne of Asgard by faking his death in Loki's second death fake out of the franchise notably, and taking his seat on the throne of Asgard. Jane Foster is obsessed with Thor to an almost annoying extent. She's trying to date other people, but only thinks of Thor. Her research has become a means to an end in finding Thor, but honestly, Thor just wants to do space shit. She's eventually possessed by the Aether, and this leads her to have some adventures on Asgard and her reuniting with Thor. Malekith takes this power eventually, but it doesn't lead to much consequence for Thor. By the end of the film, Jane kind of is just in the same place she is before, seemingly, and is kind of left there, as we wouldn't see her again for a long time in the MCU until the aforementioned Thor 4. Darcy, likewise, is just comic relief, who eventually makes out with her assistant a few times. I don't know. It's whatever. I don't care about this character.
I hate you.
The Warriors 3 and Sif are here, and like in the first movie, they don't really have any character and are really only here to be background characters in fight scenes. Odin doesn't trust Jane Foster for being human and is sad when his wife dies. That's about it from him. Frigga is Odin's wife and likes Jane Foster and is a loving mother. Definitely more of a free spirit than Odin, though. She eventually dies, and this kind of kicks the climax into gear, but otherwise, she's pretty much just a functional character. Eric Selvig is crazy following the events of the Avengers, but eventually helps Jane save Thor in the climax. He's not super notable in this movie. Malekith and the Dark Elves want the power of the Aether to control the Seven Realms. That's his whole character. He was a cool design, but he isn't really anything too deep. He's just kind of a generic villain character. Thor the Dark World certainly has literal darker moments than the first, with the cinematography being quite dark, but while the filmmakers say this film is really dark, it's actually not really that dark. It's really just a generic Marvel film aside from Frigga's death, and nothing too, edgy happens, you know? In fact, everyone seems to be in perpetual good mood, with lots of fucking jokes told constantly, which is a problem with Phase 2 especially. They really got addicted to telling jokes after Joss Whedon's Avengers, like everybody's quipping constantly. Hell, the scene where Loki and Thor steal one of the Dark Elf spaceships, every line is a joke or a quip, and this is moments after their mother dies, so you'd think they'd be like a little sad or torn up or something.
Now they're firing at us.
Yeah, thank you for the commentary, Loki. It's not at all distracting.
Well done. You just decapitated your grandfather.
Some of the quips are actually earned, but I think post-Avengers, the focus group said keep pumping in the observational humor, and it kind of undercuts the supposed dark tone of this film and a lot of tones in the MCU. It's a pretty consistent problem. I don't think a quip in a dark moment is bad for someone like Spider-Man or Iron Man, as Robert Downey Jr. plays him, but Thor, I think we need some moments where this warrior is solemn and sad if we're gonna go dark with it. But I think they just wanted to add some personality because he's so flat in the first film. I do admit though, imagery like Loki's death is kind of dark, with Loki very visually dying, but then he's just alive again a few scenes later. It undercuts itself so much that I question what the tone of this film actually is. Like, I don't know what the director was trying to capture here. Musically, this film sounds terribly generic. Brian Tyler did the music, and much like Iron Man 3, which he also did, it's just slow and boring. I even thought about it when the end credits started and the music kicked in. I was like, wow, this is underwhelming. But the interesting thing is, of course, I have no recollection of what that song even remotely sounds like, which I think is kind of the key to how underwhelming it is. But the days of Danny Elfman and John Williams scores were in the past, and so too was the consistency of music in the superhero film genre. Dan Lebenthal and Wyatt Smith edited this film, and it's fine. The film looks mostly good, but I think the story is a little jumbled, which I think was more of an issue with the script than the editing, but at points I had trouble following this pretty basic story because there were so many characters, so many MacGuffins, weird names of people that don't really do anything particularly special and stuff like that. From an action standpoint, they did a great job, and both Dan Lebenthal and Wyatt Smith have decent filmographies, with the former doing films like Iron Man, Spider-Man Homecoming and more, and the latter doing Doctor Strange and Mary Poppins Returns and stuff. They're definitely house directors for Disney, and it isn't crazy what they did here, but besides the slightly bloated script, I think they did a pretty solid job of gluing this movie together. Kramer Monthengau did the cinematography and is known for films like Chef with Jon Favreau and many Marvel films, along with the upcoming Captain America Brave New World film. And I think if there's anything I like about this film, it's the cinematography and visuals. The first Thor film, if I'm being blunt, looks like washed out dog shit, and this film adds some grime to Asgard. Everything is dark and contrasts well, with tons and tons of red put in the film, which is probably non-coincidentally the color of the Reality Stone and the Aether, as well as many of the Dark Elves' tools and weapons. The contrast is cool, and despite being such a dark color palette, the film manages to be very legible and not look too much like other films of the genre. It's not Alien vs. Predator Requiem, where you can't tell what's going on. For such a dark color palette, it actually looks quite good. I know a lot of directors were doing darker paleted films at this time, where they were tempted to rip off the look of Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, specifically the middle film, The Dark Knight, but that's not really what they did here. It's kind of unique, and I respect that. I think it actually looks pretty nice and unique for a Marvel film of this era. The end credits scene sees the Warriors 3 and Sif giving the Collector the Aether, not knowing that the demigod was already on a quest to collect the stones for their power.
I can assure you, it will be absolutely safe. Yeah.
This, of course, pays off later on and connects directly to the plot of Guardians of the Galaxy, where the Collector's attempting to get the Power Stone. Good post-credit scene. It gives us a taste of the galactic adventures in the MCU, as well as introducing us to an important character that would soon be paid off more in the Guardians of the Galaxy film. I think along with the solid-looking CG and cinematography, the Dark Elves look cool, and I like the featureless masks and white complexions. It looks cool and adds contrast to the very dark film. Black and white is literally the most contrastable color. Their ships and weaponry are also good. Moments like their assault on Asgard are very Star Wars-esque, with the minions feeling kind of like stormtroopers, but the battles are pretty fun and the ship weapons are designed very well. And while totally unpractical, I kind of like the look of their black hole grenades. That effect was pretty cool and memorable the few times they did it. The film also chose to be on Earth way less, which is a good thing. I will admit also choosing London instead of the extraordinarily boring small town in New Mexico from the first film was pretty much an automatic step up in visual interest. But still, when I come to see a Thor movie, I need to see some unique and godly environments, and this film for the most part delivers. The Foley is distracting in this movie. At 3 points, Jane slaps people, and the effect is so loud and just sounds like a stock effect I'd get in a cheap sound effect pack, not something made for a major Hollywood production. I rarely talk Foley in these videos, but it actually took me out of the film at a few places for sounding just so off kilter. Also, Loki fake dies again, which is just stupid. The end of the first Thor saw Loki seemingly die, which they never explained. He just kind of shows up in the Avengers. And at the end of that film, it was implied Thor was stuck on Asgard, but he just kind of shows up in the Avengers. Something that even bothered me at 14 years old, to the point that the end of that film was kind of ruined for me. He acted like there'd be some grand journey back, but the release schedule was coming up and they knew Avengers was pretty much next. So to see them fake Loki's death again, only to come back as Odin or something like that, is not very satisfying, and it's kind of obnoxious in my opinion. It just adds to how jumbled this film's plot is. Finally, the quips are starting to get bad and added heavily into the Marvel formula. The constant annoying jokes are a major problem for me with this franchise, since it just often becomes a bit too much. Overall, Thor: The Dark World is fine. The plot is so jumbled with so many moving pieces that it makes the plot hard to follow and forgettable, despite the fact that you lay it out and it's not very complex. I do, however, think Malekith and his henchmen look cool and are visually very memorable, along with the pretty good looking cinematography and CGI in my opinion. I think the quips in the human plot are annoying and unnecessary, and I think Thor was kind of left in an odd spot post-Thor 1 and Avengers, that much of this movie just feels odd, and perhaps at points this movie feels more obligatory than something someone actually really felt like they needed to make. I don't know who wanted to talk about Thor fighting the Dark Elves, and I don't know who wanted to see it. I just don't think there's many people that were clamoring for that. Thor 2, The Dark World, ended up making $645 million off of a budget of around $150 to $270 million. Why the estimated budget has that large of a range, I have no idea. It definitely didn't reach the height of Avengers or Iron Man 3, but it still seemingly did well enough to warrant more attention on future Thor adventures, along with definitely riding the hype train of the Avengers a bit. Thor 2 ended up with 67% on Rotten Tomatoes and a Metacritic score of 54 out of 100. The film received mixed reviews, with much of the praise going to Tom Hiddleston's Loki, who admittedly was still riding off of Avengers hype. Everybody loved him at the time. And the film was such a bad experience for Alan Taylor, who in 2021 said he wished he could do a director's cut in the same vein as Zack Snyder's Justice League. Though, as I've said on this channel a few times, that was an incredibly rare case, and I don't think many Marvel fans really care enough about Thor and this film to pull together and make something like that happen, on top of Snyder's cut being largely put out to fill out the gap in productions during COVID-19. And overall, I just think fans largely think this is one of the least memorable films in the MCU. They used to often be featured at the bottom of people's ranking lists and stuff. It wasn't uncommon to see it be kind of the punching bag of the MCU for a long while. The film was nominated for a bunch of awards for televised events, for example the MTV Movie Awards Best Shirtless Performance for Chris Hemsworth, but it failed to win anything like that even. Personally, I think Chris Hemsworth was robbed.
What did she say?